Chapter 13. The History of Soul. Joe and Sarah filed together into Wilson's. Seeing the place brought back memories of the previous night's events, and the various mistakes and failures which had led to each of their defeats. The sisters, with their characteristic stubbornness, were crushed by the reminder. They couldn't meet each other's eyes, and once they were inside the building, they drifted to opposite corners of the main room and stood in silence. So far, they were the only people there. Even Wilson himself seemed to be absent. It wasn't long, however, before the two girls were joined by the first of their friends. Tucker walked through the door slowly with his head down. His hands were placed firmly in the pockets of his baggy sweats, and there was some light spotting on his white shirt, where the wound on his arm continued to bleed a bit, even in spite of Wilson's efforts the night before. Tucker met Joe's eyes, and then the two of them looked away from each other. They didn't speak. Joe knew full well that Tucker didn't mind losing, even if he lost badly. But this loss was different. It had hit all of them harder and cut them all deeper than any defeat before. Tucker didn't know where to go from here. He didn't know what to say, and he knew that Joe wouldn't want to say anything. So he simply didn't say anything either. Another few minutes later, Jen arrived as well. She scanned the room, and after just one glance, she understood what every one of her friends was feeling. Their body language and their silence gave it all away. Jen was, thankfully, above such things. She didn't allow her doubts and insecurities to draw her emotions to the surface where they could override her logic. Since returning home the night before, Jen had been going over the exchange with the Soul Takers, or as much as she knew of it at least, in her head, trying to piece together as much as she could about them, and even deduce weaknesses in the fighting style of her and Tucker's opponent, in case she came up against him again. She didn't have anything concrete to go on yet, but she was confident that she would soon. With all four dueling hearts present, Joe found that she couldn't ignore the situation anymore. She felt responsible for what had happened to them. She felt like she needed to say something, but before she could, Wilson beat her to it. So suddenly that not one of the dueling hearts noticed, Wilson appeared in the doorway of his office. "I'm glad that all four of you came," he said. "I had half expected one or more of you to ignore my invitation." "That's ridiculous," Jen told him. "You promised to explain things, and all four of us want to know what's going on here." Wilson didn't answer. Instead, it was Sarah who spoke. "I almost didn't come," she said, almost too quietly for the others to hear. All eyes were on her, but she didn't acknowledge their gaze, and she didn't volunteer any more information. "What the four of you went through," Wilson said sympathetically, "is something that should never be experienced by anyone. The people you fought do things with soul that are, frankly, immoral and reprehensible." "Which is actually the first question that I'd like you to answer," Joe interjected. "How did you know who they were?" "I didn't," Wilson answered. "At least not specifically. I was simply able to deduce who it was that they were with." "How?" Tucker asked. "You're old, and those three were not. So unless they're like 50 years younger than anyone else in their organization, it can't be that old either." "The Soul Takers is an old organization," Wilson explained, "but this particular incarnation, it would seem, isn't." Wilson stepped the rest of the way into the room with the dueling hearts, and he began to pace. He had been kind enough to catch Sarah, Jen, and Tucker up on what the Soul Takers had wanted the night before they had made their way home. He had been frank about it, but now the four young fighters could see on his face that he was trying to decide how to proceed with this further explanation, and they were surprised by his choice. He stopped walking, held his hands behind his back, and, without looking at them again, he asked, "How much do you four know about the history of soul?" The dueling hearts looked at each other questioningly. They were soul fighters. They all knew the history of soul. Why would Wilson ask them such a ridiculous question? He had to be joking, and yet he said nothing else, waiting patiently for an answer. It was Jen who finally gave him one. "We know as much as anyone," Jen told him. "More," Joe added, "since there are things that Mom knows that most people don't." Wilson met Joe's eyes. Between her still aching body and the fact that, even now, her brain was still processing the events of the night before, it took her a few seconds to realize that Wilson wanted Joe to actually recount what Shannon had taught her. "Put simply, soul appeared 30 years ago," Joe explained, "and changed the world when people learned how to use it." "Don't put it simply," Wilson insisted. "Tell me all that you know." "Okay," Joe relented, confused. "I guess, technically, soul actually means two things. Back when it first appeared, people thought that the energy was being made in people's bodies, but now we know that everyone has kind of a bundle of energy, a personal soul, inside of them that they can mix with their life energy to generate more soul energy from somewhere else. We only use the same term for both because of that old misconception." "And?" Wilson prompted. "And," Joe concluded, reaching now for more to say, "if you look at history, it's pretty clear that soul existed in ancient times as well. All of the old myths and stories of magic and mysticism can be explained by soul." Wilson nodded. "That's true. In fact, soul has existed for most of human history. The few thousand years leading up to the resurgence 30 years ago was the odd exception. That means that soul, the power that we wield today, is the same power wielded by men and women long dead. And I mean that literally. It is the exact same power. What does that mean? Jen asked. All eyes were firmly on Wilson now. There is reason to believe, Wilson said, turning to face the four dueling hearts, that soul, like other forms of energy, cannot be created or destroyed. That when soul is called upon and then used up by a person, it simply returns to wherever it is that soul comes from in the first place. So the soul that people possess now must draw from that same well of soul energy that those ancient people also drew upon. The soul that we all bear today existed those thousands of years ago. It hasn't changed. That makes sense, Jen remarked. It's like when you burn something, you're not actually creating new energy, you're just releasing the chemical energy stored in whatever you're burning. Energy which has been recycled since the Big Bang. But what does any of this have to do with the guys who attacked us? If soul is so ancient, Wilson continued, and ancient myths are actually stories of people with strong souls, then that would mean that the ancient gods of those myths were real people with unique souls so strong that mortal men could hardly ever compare. You're saying, Sarah chimed in, that, like, the ancient Greek and Egyptian gods were real? That's where you're going with this? Exactly, Wilson replied, and then moved on immediately without giving the dueling hearts even a moment's pause to let the new information sink in. For lack of any better term, Wilson explained, pacing again, I've been calling souls like these divine souls. It's incredibly rare, but some people do seem to have internal souls, those bundles of energy as you call them, he looked knowingly at Joe, which are special in a specific way. From what I've learned, they do not come about when a person's soul awakens, like a natural or an unnatural soul. Someone is born with a divine soul, and then it awakens just like any other, becoming either a divine natural soul or a divine unnatural soul. As far as I've been able to tell from what little research I've been able to do, Wilson continued, his words coming faster and faster now, there is only one person alive today who has been born with one of these unique kinds of souls, and that's the leader of the Soul Takers. Divine souls have broader powers that most other souls can never grow to match, and their leader has one of the deadliest divine souls of all. He can take the souls from others, Jen said, nodding. Yes, Wilson agreed, that too, but that ability only works on those who are already weak or vulnerable. What makes him dangerous in battle is that taking the soul from those he's defeated has allowed him to grow his own soul to levels impossible with training alone. He also seems able to take some of the knowledge from his victims, bolstering his own skills without having to work as hard. He can also apparently reverse these abilities, granting techniques and knowledge to his followers. This is a lot to take in, Tucker stammered. He walked over to a chair against the far wall and sat down, touching his injured arm gingerly. I suppose it must be, Wilson agreed, nodding. But unfortunately, we simply don't have time for me to ease all of you into this slowly. I realize that this information changes everything, but we don't have any choice but for you four to internalize it quickly. Okay, Sarah said. Sure, I'm internalizing, but I still don't understand a few things. If this guy has such a dangerous soul, why did he send those three after us instead of coming himself? And what does any of this have to do with us anyway? Wilson stopped pacing and looked to each of the dueling hearts in turn. 30 years ago, he explained. When Soul returned to the world, their leader formed the original Soul Takers. He worked in the shadows for 11 years, striking out against other blossoming soul bearers until a small group of brave fighters stood up to him. What small group? Sarah mused, cutting Wilson off mid-sentence, drawing a look of annoyance that she ignored. Wait, she asked, are you talking about the Six Masters? Are they the ones that stood against this guy? Wilson answered after a short pause. No, I really don't think so. Remember, the Six Masters knew each other from the early internet. We don't even know if they ever met in person. But perhaps it was some of the other early fighters, ones who learned from the principles that the Masters shared. As far as I've been able to deduce, Wilson explained, 3 fighters stood against the leader of the Soul Takers. They damaged his soul itself, forcing him to retreat, leaving him with no way to repair that damage and regain his old abilities. He also, for some reason, seemed to be gravely injured along with his soul. It even seemed that if his soul were left to degrade, he would eventually die. He had no way to prevent that until now. Back around the time that Soul originally faded from the world, Wilson continued, another man with a divine soul met a similar fate. He lost a battle and his soul was broken into pieces and scattered to the wind. However, it was foretold by one whose soul allowed them to see important future events that the pieces of his soul would be reborn one day in a select group of special warriors with natural talent and a drive great enough to one day grow those fragments into full divine souls once again. The leader of the Soul Takers seeks those warriors, so that he can take their souls and use them to heal his own. But the Soul Takers were after us, Joe replied. Wilson met her eyes, and she ran through all that he had said again until it clicked. "You mean," she said, "that the 4 of us are those special warriors?" "Some of them, yes," Wilson answered. "Who are the others?" Sarah asked with a dazed look in her eyes. "I don't know," Wilson told her. "How can someone's soul be injured?" Jen asked. "And how can someone else's soul be used to heal it?" "That one is difficult to explain," Wilson replied, "and I don't understand it fully myself. But from what I can tell, divine souls are far more tangible than regular souls. And since their raw energy is only a perfect match for other divine souls, only the energy of other divine souls can serve as a bandage to repair them. Other soul will eventually be rejected, like a bad organ transplant. He might be able to use the soul of other, regular soul fighters to stop the wound from getting any worse, but he'll never fully recover that way." "And if there were someone other than the warriors you were talking about?" Jo asked, still having trouble counting herself among them. "Who was known to have one of these divine souls? Their leader would be going after them too?" "That's right," Wilson answered. "In fact, it's likely that he would have given up hope by now, if not for the old story that I mentioned before. It is only because of the predictions made in that story that he even knows that you exist." "So we have, special powers?" Sarah asked. She sounded skeptical rather than excited, and she looked like she was desperate for the answer. "Not automatically," Wilson told her and the other dueling hearts. "You have the potential to develop more varied abilities than most people with regular souls. You also have the power to grow stronger simply by fighting, if you fight fiercely enough. But your souls are still yours to develop however you choose to. You have the potential for greatness, but just like everyone, it's up to you to reach that potential." He stood there, silent, as if waiting to take more questions. Jo felt like she should have more to ask, but nothing actually came to mind, so she didn't say anything. It ended up being Tucker who spoke next. He'd had enough time now to process what Wilson was really saying, and he'd come to one conclusion. "This is crazy," he announced. "Would you care to elaborate regarding what exactly you find crazy, Mr. Tucker?" Wilson asked in a tone that sounded kindly, but purposely so. "All of it," Tucker ranted, hopping up from his chair and pacing back and forth. "Everything that you said. It's all nuts." "And is it also nuts, Mr. Tucker?" Wilson asked, speaking deliberately and giving Tucker a look very much like the one that he had given the Soul Takers the night before, "that a group of 3 might appear in town, with trading in soul that goes beyond anything that any of you 4 have ever seen, and targets the 4 of you specifically?" Tucker glared at Wilson, but his expression wasn't as harsh as he wanted it to be. Jo could already see the beginnings of acceptance behind his fiery gaze. "Because that happened, Mr. Tucker," Wilson continued, taking a slow step toward Tucker, and then another, "and they intend to return in only 2 short weeks, or rather 13 days now, and if you aren't ready to face them when they arrive, they will attack you again, and maybe even kill you. That remains true even if they cannot take your soul away from you, or if nothing else that I've said today is the truth." Tucker looked away from Wilson submissively, but he was far from admitting out loud that he was beginning to believe Wilson's story. "Wait," Sarah said. "Tucker's right, at least kinda. This is crazy. It's crazy that you expect us to fight these guys again." "Yeah," Jo agreed. "Will, those guys seem to know you, and they were afraid of you. Can't you do something about them?" "They did not know me," Wilson replied, a tinge of sadness in his tone. "They were merely able to use soul to gauge my potential. In their tired state, my full strength might have been enough to drive them off, but even fighting at my full potential for that long might have been enough to finish this frail body of mine. If I were to fight them at my best, even going all out with every technique that I know, I would lose instantly." Jo didn't know what to say. She had hoped that her master was somehow some sort of superhuman, like Roshi from Dragon Ball, who could just handle the problem of the Soul Takers for her. She thought about suggesting that the Dueling Hearts fight with him, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. What if he was overestimating himself and any amount of serious combat at all would kill him? Jo couldn't risk that. "That's actually not what I meant," Sarah said, interrupting Jo's thoughts. "It's crazy that you expect us to fight these guys again when we could just run away. They're coming back here. All we have to do is get out of town until they leave." "I can get behind that plan," Tucker agreed, his hand shooting up over his head. Wilson looked like he was about to say something, but Jen beat him to it. "No, that's stupid." Sarah glared at her, and Jen said, "Sorry, I don't mean that you're stupid. I just mean that I don't think you guys are quite grasping how impossible that would be. If these Soul Takers are really so numerous that they're able to organize on a global scale, which they would have to be in order to seek out a few special souls among billions of people, then to escape them we'd have to disappear forever. And even then, even if we were careful, we'd still be at risk of them finding us entirely by accident. That's why witness protection is so tricky." Jen looked at each other member of the Dueling Hearts in turn. "I think Wilson's right. The only way to end this is to get strong enough to fight these guys ourselves." The other Dueling Hearts looked to Jo. It took her a second to notice, but once she did, she realized that they were expecting her to decide what they would do. She was technically the leader of their team, but this was far from what she had signed up for. These were the kinds of decisions that she had never even imagined having to make, yet she found that she was willing to make this one, if only so that her friends wouldn't have to. So Jo considered their options for a few moments. She found herself once again thinking about Karen and how she had moved during their fight, and, strangely enough, about her smile. That was enough to snap Jo out of her reverie, and finally she asked, "Will, do you really think you can train us to beat those guys in 2 weeks?" Wilson grinned confidently and nodded. "I do." "Then we stay," Jo announced, "and we fight." The Dueling Hearts didn't exactly seem happy about Jo's decision, and Jo didn't blame them. She didn't like it any more than they did, after all, though their willingness to stand with her made her feel significantly better. Meanwhile, Wilson nodded, noting the looks of acceptance on the faces of his newest students. "In that case," he announced, "the first lesson begins right now."